I'm Tony Maciulis. I'm the Chief Content Officer of GZERO Media, which is a Eurasia Group company. I work for the political scientist Ian Bremmer. We heard just moments ago from the forum's president that the past 7 years since the founding of this forum, it feels like yesterday. I can tell you, if you cover geopolitics, it feels like decades, actually, and not like yesterday at all. And today, in our first session, we actually have the super easy task of spending an hour fixing the United Nations as it turns 80. So we're going to have a great panel here with us who have experience across the spectrum. They've worked in government, they've worked in civil society, they've worked in academia. And hopefully we can at least get to some place where we can begin action items on this very important topic. I want to start, though, with a little audience interaction moment. I also want to say I know some of you don't have headsets yet, so they are passing them out as we get ready to begin. As I was preparing for this segment, I thought about something that the former US ambassador to the UN and then the US Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, said, which is, if the UN didn't exist, we would have to invent it today. I'm sort of wondering, to start on a bit of a provocative question, does anybody disagree with that? If there were no UN, would you not invent it today? Show of hands. All right, that was just a call for a headset, not a show of hand. But okay, so good news is you are in the majority, right? So globally, most people feel that the UN is necessary. However, there are also a growing number of people that feel that it's either irrelevant or ineffective. So we're going to confront those challenges. We're going to talk a little bit about that and what reform is going to look like. I want to call up a rock star panel, by the way, and as President Bachelet said backstage, with this microphone, she feels like a rock star, like Madonna's on tour. So first, we've got Michelle Bachelet, who of course is the former President of Chile, former High Commissioner for Human Rights in the United Nations, and women, UN women. Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Executive Director of GWL Voices for Change and Inclusion, the 73rd President, by the way, of the UN General Assembly, and former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Ecuador. Jim Steinberg is the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's also worked in government, State Department, and as National Security Advisor. And we have Marietta Jaeger, who is Deputy Director General, the Directorate General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. And last but not least at all, Henry Huiyao Wang, who is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, also held many roles in policy in the Chinese government. Welcome to you all. Okay, so Madame Bachelet, I want to start with you. We have heard directly from the Secretary General back in March when he launched the UN 80 initiative, some pretty staggering statistics. 27,000 meetings in the year, over 240-ish organizations, 4,000 member state mandates coming through the Secretariat. Are we talking about process paralysis? What, from your perspective, is the biggest issue right now?
Well, let me tell you, Tony, that one of the things that I had when I was High Commissioner of Human Rights is that I have thousands of meetings in presence or during the pandemic by Zoom. And you said, but we are in so many one. Is it really needed this? So what I think is not a paralysis, but what is clear, and I think that what the Secretary General has done through the UN 80 is to look at how we can not reinvent the UN. The UN needs to exist, but needs to have results in efficient and effective manner. It needs to be able to maintain its principles, the main principles on the Charter, but on the other hand, adapt to the current world. And it needs to find ways of doing things that can ensure more effectiveness, transparency, and in a way that people can rebuild trust in the UN. The UN needs to be relevant so people can trust them. But the other way to trust is to be able to maintain the principles, but also to work with the people, to listen, but to look inside all the things that needed to be done to be able to really be able to be effective and to have the results that people need. It needs to have results on the ground, so people can feel that their lives are improving, that multilateralism is something that really produces real positive benefits. To be true, that is all what you say is true. But on the other hand, this has been the 80th anniversary. It's called the Oak anniversary, because I think the UN endures lots of things. It's a space for dialogue, for agreements, for cooperation. I mean, during the ceremony in September on the 80th commemoration of the 80th anniversary, in both speeches, the PGA, the President of the General Assembly, and Antonio Guterres, they did mention what have we saved, how many conflicts were able to be prevented, how many lives will be saved, how many humanitarian help was produced, how many, if it didn't exist, how many of those would have been deaths, grievances, etc. So I think the UN needs to continue, but needs to continue with improving their management, reinforce and strengthen, and adapt to the real conditions today. And I think the UN reform that the Secretary General is developing goes in that direction. Of course, afterwards, the importance is how it is implemented, because, you know, papers can accept anything. So what we need is real action. But I do believe that the world needs multilateralism. We have global challenges that we need to deal all together. No one will save itself, as I said in my opening remarks. And there are reforms. There is something, though, that needs to be reconsidered. This year have been so many summits. I mean, I'm here. On Monday, I'm going to Qatar for the social development.
Then I go Abu Dhabi on Monday for an AI
Then I go to COP, and I just came from others, Sevilla as well, and so on. And I think it's too much, because sometimes member states don't go, and so on. And we need to be more strategic. And if I would say, to do everything we need to do, but on the other hand, we need to be better organized and organize the UN towards the people.
Right.
I mean, of course, you always have to have the great persons inside, but we need to ensure that the people feels that the multilateral organization, not only the UN, but in particular the UN, is a relevant one for their lives.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm going to jump around a little to keep people on their toes. So, Jim, we heard President Bachelet say it's the Oak anniversary. I guess the question is, at this point, is this organization that was born out of the needs of World War II, literally the ashes of World War II, still a strong enough tree to stand, or do we have some problems at the roots?
I think it's a great question, Henry, and it's great to be with this panel, because, you know, I think that, you know, we can focus kind of narrowly on the question of the United Nations and the specialized agencies and the procedures and process. But I think we have a deeper question about global governance that's at stake here, and how do we manage the challenges of our time. You know, you asked a very provocative question about if we didn't have the UN now, would we invent it? I don't think we would invent it in the form that it exists today. That doesn't mean we should just scrap it, but I think that the world has changed in dramatic ways, and we need to think in a very pragmatic way about the way in which these different international challenges need to be addressed, and to recognize that there's a bit of a tension between the high ambitions and the kind of the big vision and the realities on the ground. I mean, it's most dramatic in the case of peace and security, where the Security Council itself has, and we've all known for a long time, not really the tool that's going to deal with many of these challenges, and to think much more pragmatically about this. I think we have to think about a sort of a pluralistic approach to dealing with these things. We call it, it's a great British expression, horses for courses, right? That we think about how we adapt the institutions to deal with each of the different challenges, recognizing that we need different kind of geometries to deal with all of them, and to recognize that not everybody is going to play in each case. And that's most dramatically in the case of the United States. I mean, the notion that the U.S. Is going to, you know, broadly support all of the multilateral institutions and all the UN agencies is just not going to be sustainable in the long term. You've seen our ambassador really talk about a kind of pick and choose approach to which agencies, which programs we're going to support. That's something that began a long time ago, back when I was at the State Department in the 90s, when Jesse Helms was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. But I think that's more broadly true today, that we have to recognize that we have to think about different kinds of coalitions dealing with different kinds of problems, and to recognize that, as the UN has recognized and the international community has recognized, that it's not just states that have to deal with these problems, and that we need to bring different kinds of actors together, civil society, experts, the private sector, and others, to deal with these challenges. We see this in public health, for example, recognizing that having to engage all kinds of different communities in addition to the formal international organizations is really important.
Yeah, you know, and you talk about the picking and choosing that the United States is doing right now, but to some extent, look, there's some fairness in the need to cut down on redundancies and the fact that, I mean, the Secretary General himself has pointed out there are several agencies that are responsible for very similar work, and they're not necessarily communicating in the right ways. Maria, you know, having been there leading the General Assembly, I'm curious what you think is needed to better serve the member states, how you're approaching UN 80.
Well, thank you, Tony, and bonjour, Paris. It's great to be back at the Paris Peace Forum. And to answer your question is, I think that sometimes, of course, I was the president of the General Assembly, but I was also ambassador of my country to Geneva, to New York, so I know the machinery, how it works. I've never worked for the UN, but I know how it works. And I have to tell you, of course, we all complain that the UN is undergoing a deep liquidity crisis. We saw the budget cuts for this year, around 30% cuts. $3.72 billion in 2024 being reduced in 600 million. And I think, of course, and on the humanitarian budget being reduced in about 40%, especially if we look at the IOM, the Migration Organization, the World Food Program. So these are big cuts. And of course, we regret that. But this is a symptom that the system is not delivering, that the system is not responding to the people it has to serve. So it is also an opportunity and a wake-up call to do something that we need to do, which is mainstream, prioritize, rationalize, be accountable to the people we serve. And you mentioned some numbers, Tony. 27,000 meetings, no, per year.
I thought I had a lot of meetings.
No. 1,100 reports annually that the organization produces. 40,000 resolutions, which 80% of them have no review or sunset clauses. This is not an organization of the 21st century. I'm sorry. And sometimes when we say the word reform, I can see, because the 25 years I've been connected to the system, we've been talking about the word reform. And sometimes I see reform fatigue. You know, I see an exercise of emptying the word reform in ways that everybody says the magical word reform, but we mean different things. And here I would say I agree with the variable geometry approach. There are some profound management reforms that need to happen in a fast-track way, because these are decisions that can be made, and this is going to be fast-tracked because of lack of resources, which is good and bad, honestly. The second part of the reform is about more accountability, more transparency, and more action on the ground. And the third is an issue of a structural reform. And the structural reform, let me give you an example. And the example is, for example, the long-awaited reform of the Security Council. The long-awaited reform of the peace and security architecture. For example, what is the design that we need for a proper, well-functioning peacekeeping architecture? And perhaps, not perhaps, I'm convinced the UN should be the capital of the world for prevention. So the prevention agenda in the organization has to be completely pushed forward. 1 ounce in prevention is worth 1 ton of response. The IMF said it, and this is a Benjamin Franklin sentence, by the way. No, but basically, $1 invested in prevention is worth $1,000 in response. So it's cost effective. And what we are, and with that I would close, to say we are living a world of high multipolarity. Many actors, many ad hoc groups, the BRICS, the G20, and all of that. But we still need a universal platform to get organized and to govern our commons. And that platform is called the United Nations 2.0, the United Nations for the 21st century. And there is a lot of homework ahead of us, but the organization is not a self-operating machine. It's a human-made organization, and the responses and the profound reforms have to be human under the right leadership.
Tony, may I say
Yes,
something?
please, sure.
Because, you know, when people speak about the need of reform, and I agree completely with what Maria Fernanda said, one thinks that the internal reform will solve the problems. But let me tell you my experience being part of the UN.
Sure.
I went to be High Commissioner of Human Rights, and I saw there were so many mandates, some very old. I thought, is that necessary? And I said, let me review these mandates. And what I received from member states, every baby has a father and a mother.
Yeah.
Don't go that way. And Ban Ki-moon was always complaining. Madam President, she always said me, Madam President, you know, I want to do reforms. Member states come to tell me, we need reforms in the UN, but don't touch my people.
Yeah.
So it's not about only the internal architectural reform.
Yeah.
It's the mentality of member states that they don't want to lose anything. They want to change everything like the Gato Pardo, but to maintain, you know. So
Even I knew what that meant. Yeah.
sorry. Maybe it's too Italian. But what I mean to say is that it's not only about internal reform.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to think differently. Member states need to think differently.
Absolutely.
So this reform can really be effective.
Right.
Otherwise, we might do more with less, because that's the issue. But if member states continue giving more mandates, it won't. I mean, we're not going to be able even to implement those mandates.
So you have both raised so many issues that I want to dive deeper into, and Jim as well. Security Council reform, how to handle the many multiple mandates coming in. And to your point, Madame Bachelet, I interviewed Guy Ryder during UNGA, and you know, he made that point too, that you know, how we know that we need to prioritize what's most important, but if a member state brings a mandate, and it's most important to them, and so there's a lot that has to be discussed there. But let me go down to Margetta. So from your perspective in Brussels, tell us a little bit about how you're viewing reform and reflections on some of what you've heard.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. As you know, the EU is fully committed to fostering really fair and effective and inclusive multilateralism, and of course value and rule-based. And in this light, of course, we are very keen to contribute to UN 80 reform because we really support UN 80 initiative, but we call, and this is my first message, for the maximum ambition, I mean, really in its delivery. Because we all know that there is an urgent need to reduce duplication and fragmentation. They are everywhere. Even in the latest report of the Secretary General, we see that there is a huge room of maneuver, basically, to eliminate duplication and basically do more on efficiency and result-oriented, I would say, UN. But basically, what we really need to orient it's to focus on great impact and really to find the coherence and effectiveness of the system. What does it mean? I mean, reforming UN, as Michel just said, it's not so easy because, of course, there are interests of member states and 40,000 mandates and how many seats, and of course, it will be very, very difficult to find a consensus. But the issue is that we need to start with the design. We need to be, as I said, ambitious. We need to merge, sometimes cut. We need to do the system consolidation, starting with the merge of agencies. There are some proposals, UN, FPA, UN women and some others, but also I would say the secretariat. We need to be very ambitious when it comes to the secretariat and really focus and reinforce the core mandates, I would say, and avoid really the duplication also on the country level. We really supported in 2019 the reform of a country resident, and I think that we should really again reinforce that, but also I think we need to do a lot on financial consolidation. I mean, I can talk for hours about that, since EU and its member states, we are the larger contributor now, and of course we contribute now 42% of ODA, and basically we will support the Secretary General, this one and the next one, whoever that will be. Personally, I would prefer to see the woman, but
We're going to talk about that. Yeah, don't worry. That's on the agenda.
We will support everyone who will follow up on the reform and be extremely ambitious when it comes to the result, delivery, and of course effectiveness and efficiency of the UN.
Thank you.
very
Yeah,
much.
no, and again, so much there that we're going to continue to unpack. Dr. Wang, so China has positioned itself as both a supporter of the UN, but also an advocate for reform. I'm curious, in this moment of the multipolar world, how you see China as a factor in multilateralism and at the UN, and how you're viewing reform.
Thank you. I think this topic is really relevant. Upgrade UN, 80 years going on. What I think now, China actually is continuously playing a much bigger role now. For example, China just announced recently China going to donate 500 million to the WHO. We see U.S. is pulling out of that. But of course, also China, now President Xi just recently announced the China Global Governance Initiative. Basically, stress that we need to stick to the UN principle. We need to really respect, the rule of the UN. Not the rule of the others, but rule of the UN. So that's really, I think, also sovereignty, territorial integrity, and also have to do actually, practical, performance-oriented results. So those are really, I think, the latest position. I think China's leader has just recently announced that. And what I personally think, actually, I would think the UN really the two most important tasks, peace and security, right? It's really important. So the peace, we talk about peacekeeping. I think the UN peacekeeping should really play an important role in ending the war in Ukraine and in Gaza and in many other places. We really have to strengthen that. So, for example, now we see this Ukraine-Russian war has been fighting for almost 4 years now, and then yet there's no ending in sight. So what I think that UN can do is that really pass a new resolution at the Security Council, and then let's get the BRICS country involved. You get, because President Trump said they're not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and then we, EU, going to have all the troops there, but then we need probably other third parties, that like China, India, Brazil, Turkey, or South Africa, So I think, this kind of peacekeeping is important. China is the biggest peace-sending country of the P5 member countries, and same for India, also quite large. So I think, we need to bring the BRICS, element really to reflect this multipolar world, and then really to guarantee the peace of in Ukraine and Middle East and even North Korea and also so many places. So I think that part is really important. We need to strengthen peacekeeping. Second part, I think the fundamentally, in order to have the peacekeeping, we need to really reform the UN Security Council, basically, right? I just published an op-ed at the Foreign Policy recently about reform Security Council. So I think now we have something global governance architecture available there, is basically the G20. Why don't we bring the G20 into Security Council, G21 including African Union, European Union, and then let's have that. And so now expand the Security Council from 15 to 21. So let's design a new system that if a single P5 member veto, then we have to subject that veto to a two-thirds majority of the G20 of the Security Council 21 countries. If two-thirds of the Security Council 21 can override that veto, on top of that, we need a General Assembly have another two-thirds to override that veto. That that would be stand. So, of course, permanent member veto, that is okay. But not, we're just against the single one. Because, for example, we see since the founding of the UN 80 years, Russia has vetoed 130, 40 times, US is about 100 times, and UK 30 sometimes, China 20 times, France 18 times. So it's, we need to prevent that abuse of that veto. For example, can't solve this thing in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Middle East. Let's really reform UN. So I think that probably is most important. So we reflect both, can have the peace and security, that you have really reformed the UN, upgraded the UN, and upgrade the Security Council. So that's my take on this UN reform.
Well, so Dr. Wang, and maybe even others, Maria Fernanda, because you mentioned the Security Council as well, everything you're saying, if you're just out here casually listening to this, you're like, of course, that sounds perfectly reasonable. Expand the Security Council, change the power of the veto. But it hasn't happened for very
80.
specific reasons, right? Yeah, so why hasn't it happened? And
It's
what
not.
would it
It's
take?
not going to happen, Henry. I mean, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer on the panel, but I also think that we've been through this for the entire history of the UN.
Yeah.
And we couldn't do it during the Cold War. There was a brief moment in the kind of the great moment in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, but we're back into it again. And there is a reality. I hate the phrase, but which is generally called the great power competition, which is the dominant factor in the international environment today. And as long as
Maybe closer to the mouth because
Yeah,
if you
it's
move-
on. It's on.
it's on. Is this
There you
better?
go.
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the reality. And when I talk about sort of thinking about the challenges, I mean, I think that we have to have a UN which maps on to the reality. And none of the major powers are going to allow Chapter 7 type operations and mandatory stuff to take place that they believe fundamentally threatens their interest. So when we think about the role of the UN in peace and security, we have to think about, first of all, your point about prevention, which is powerful and much more open to finding consensus and taking action. But second, to realize that there are other strategies to deal with peace and security. Most of the good work that's been done has often been done by regional organizations, for example, and we need to think about that. I mean, we've always had Chapter 8, and we've always thought that that was an important part of it, but we have to recognize that there's an abstraction about this conversation that when people get to sitting in the Situation Room or in Zhongnanhai or in the Kremlin, that this is not going to be a reality. So I think it's important for us all to sort of understand that piece of the architecture and to work with it, and rather than to sort of put this tension in which people say, well, we've got to reform the Security Council, it's not being reformed, so this is a failure. We're setting ourselves up for failure if that becomes the definition. Rather, we have to think about how do we take the world as it is and build the structures and institutions that can work with those realities.
Mm-hmm. I want to turn back to humanitarian aid cuts for just a second and actually ask you, Madam Bachelet, and others who want to weigh in. So we're already in a position where voluntary contributions are down, and that, by the way, didn't start with the Trump administration. That's been an ongoing trend over the past several years. Also, we know in general, in terms of percentage of donated contributions from member states and globally, and the part that goes to humanitarian aid in the global GDP is minuscule to begin with. So now when we start cutting more programs, right, what kind of real world consequences will that have, and what concerns you most?
Well, if we have been said that prevention is essential, and if you don't, if you underfund certain areas, one is humanitarian, but the other is human rights. Human rights received right now, before the cutting, less than 1% of all the regular budget of the UN. And it's one of the three pillars, peace and security, development, and human rights. And we know is that if we ensure that the rights of the people can be guaranteed, you will have less conflicts. We see big conflicts, but people usually doesn't see the conflict that you have every weekend between herders and farmers because of lack of enough water or enough soil, and hundreds of deaf people there. And then you need to go with humanitarian action. But if you can prevent the conflict from happening, ensuring an adequate and regulated access to some of these things, you could prevent a lot of things. People talking about migration and its consequences. Well, if we are able to work much more on the roots of the causes why people migrate, we might have, and migration is linked to health issues, food insecurity, conflict. I'm talking not only migration, but also internal displaced people. There's lots, millions of them, and this will be increasing. The lack of humanitarian action as well, linked to other, I would say, cut of fundings for issues like sexual and reproductive services will mean many probably will increase maternal mortality or child mortality. So there's so many issues: food insecurity, hunger, and of course, after that, more conflict. So instead of preventing, we will be causing probably huge consequences that we will have to face with less, an organization with less resources to be able to deal with that. So I think sometimes some of the decisions are not very strategic. They seem like in the short term, very good, but in the long term and medium term will produce bigger consequences. That will, so we're talking about peace and security, yes, but we're doing a lot of things that will make us have to have more confrontations, more conflicts, and more, I would say, humankind grievances. So I know, and probably the typical donors, today they are confronted to the need to support Ukraine in the war. So many traditional donors have cut funds, not just now, before as well. When I was High Commissioner, they also cut some funds on this side. But we need to understand that if we do not finance certain issues, we're going to provoke more consequences and more conflicts. And that's not the way to look at the international issues, because we will be producing more problems. And I'm sure that will happen. And they're all interlinked, intertwined.
Right. So, Jim, to pick up on that for just a second. So, look, what Madame Bachelet is saying about, the world is facing, compounding crises, which is true. We've had, the past 5 years, let's face it, have been probably the most consequential of my lifetime, at least, looking at pandemic into the war in Ukraine, into Gaza, into political polarization rising, right? So yes, that's part of the equation, that money, we don't have that much money to go around, and so we have to pick and choose. But there is also the political moment and the polarization to confront. And the fact that a lot of what she just said, gender, migration, all of those things are trigger words for some people right now. So are we living in a finite moment of a political blip, or has there been a tectonic shift that's going to impact how we approach multilateralism?
It's a great question, Henry, and there's a very important and really interesting poll that just came out from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, looking at American attitudes here. And what it points to is exactly what you're talking about, which is the polarization, which is it is still true that a majority of Americans, for example, support the UN and actually believe that the U.S. should do more with the UN, even if it means compromising from the positions we want. But if you break it down into Democrats, independents, and Republicans, the difference is startling. I just happen to bring the numbers with me. So while 2/3 agree that we should do more, the numbers consist of 83% of Democrats believe that, but only 40% of Republicans believe it. And among the so-called MAGA Republicans, more than 2/3 do not believe the United States should work with the UN if it means having to compromise a U.S. position. So it is that polarization. And I think that the key to this, at least from the U.S. perspective, is really not to make the best the enemy of the good, to think about those things where we can get people to see that there is an alignment, that there's a shared set of interests, and not expect to sort of immediately overcome the polarization. And I think that is really the secret of success here, is to work where the glass is half full, where there is a sense that there are things that needed to be done, and don't hit the trigger issues that you talk about. I can agree with many people on the importance of gender, for example, in dealing with these. There's no doubt, as a former policymaker and as a scholar, I know that is the case. But making that case to a domestic audience in the United States is hard. But dealing with issues like disease is something where there is a broad set of support. So it's recognizing those places where you can overcome the polarization. I think that's the place to start.
Yeah, I mean, by the way, we're going to get to the gender question in a bigger way. I'm trying to tease toward it because it is a really important question. But Marietta, you know, polarization is not unique to the United States. I mean, Europe certainly is encountering its own rise of political opposition. And I'm curious how that impacts how the EU views UN reform and if there's enough consensus there.
That's a very good question, I would say as well. I mean, we all know that we are all fully aware that we are facing huge geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges, no? I would say on all continents, and unfortunately in some more in others. So I believe that European Union, when it comes to the decision making, especially on sustainable development in the area that I cover, I mean, for example, I can tell you that when it comes to new financial perspective that we are going to negotiate now, I mean, we propose as a Commission increased budget for development and humanitarian aid. I mean, which means that we would like to stay basically very predictable, stable partner and donor. And I think that member states and the European Parliament will hopefully follow our wisdom, because we believe that, yes, you are right, that the resources are shrinking. Unfortunately, in some countries, almost 85, 90%, in some others, you know, 9. And I mean, we all know, according to OECD, you know, we had a 9% decrease last year. For 25, we are expecting 17% decrease. But again, I mean, we tend to believe that we are really stable and reliable donor and partner. As I said, 42% of ODA, you know, will probably increase in 25 for EU. But again, when it comes to the decision making, I mean, when it comes also to areas like climate or gender, I can tell you that I was very proud. We had a statement in the Development Committee of the World Bank 10 days ago, basically focusing on climate and gender. I mean, 10 years after Paris, 30 years after Beijing, I mean, we are discussing, can we use the word gender or climate? I mean, this is not something that we've been fighting for. And in our legislation, I mean, we have currently legislation where 85% of all our action need to be female gender sensitive. And we are going to the next gender action plan. And of course, you know, for example, we walk the talk. I mean, whenever we are giving, for example, EFSD Plus guarantees, we do the discount, price discount on guarantees for female businesses, for female sensitive actions. And climate is a pillar of our global gateway strategy that basically want to bring investments and private sector into the occasion, because it's clear, and no one is mentioning private sector, I mean, that we will not be able to do it alone with the public money. And here, I mean, again, I agree with you, it's all in alignment. It's a shared interest, and basically building public trust and confidence in our action, in multilateralism, that basically increase accountability and efficiency. And we will only achieve that with the concrete results. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, let's stay on that theme of public and private. I don't know, Maria Fernanda, if you might want to weigh in on this. It's multi-stakeholder approach is sort of the buzzword you hear at every one of these conferences. And I think we all know what that means, which is a more diverse set of people having a seat at the table. Ultimately, private sector is what we're talking about. So how can we move forward with better relationships between the private sector and both multilateral organizations, but also individual governments?
Well, I think your question, Tony, is a question about agency. Because basically, when we say, and the UN should do this and that these are the ideas, and reform the Security Council, who has to do that? Who are the agents of change? And that's, I think we understand that the United Nations is an intergovernmental platform. Therefore, any reform or any transformation has to be owned politically by member states. What Michelle was saying, when you talk about reform, everybody, oh no, my little, resolution on this and that, and no sunset clauses and all of that. So I think that we have reached a moment where we have to think about the common good, and this is not naive. We have to think. Multilateralism is a word that is very difficult to pronounce, but it translates very easily. It's collective action and international cooperation. There are things in the world of today that require universal agreement to govern our commons. The atmosphere, for example, the high seas, for example, health security. And who are the actors? Of course, the political ownership and the leadership of member states, it's without doubt. Of course, the guidance and the technical traction from the Secretariat, the executive, but also society. Everybody says multilateralism is in crisis, but this is the time in my almost 30 years of experience where I see the most vibrant movement outside of the UN thinking about alternatives, proposals, a new financing compact for the UN, because we cannot leave, the problem. No, alignment, prioritize, rationalize, and a new financial compact. I agree with you where the private sector has a say. But let's be clear, when we say the private sector, it cannot be an ad hoc situation. Oh, we need that, call the private sector. No, we are coming up with a resolution, put and others, including the private sector. It should not be a phrase. The UN has no rules and regulations for a transparent, a constructive participation of civil society. It's case by case. And of course, the private sector needs clear rules, needs certainty, needs to be to feel that they are part of the equation. The same goes for civil society. The same goes for academia and the thinkers, men and women around the world. So this has to be a collective endeavor. And multilateralism has to be translated into collective action to govern our commons. And we need to start using the words that everybody would understand in the street. And that's, I think, what makes also the UN, having this golden opportunity to connect and communicate with the people it serves, to make the UN relevant. That was the motto of my presidency, actually, to make the UN relevant for all. And here, I would say, when we talk, agencies one, a new financing compact, but when we talk about budgets, and here I think it's important that we understand that budgets are not numbers and it's not money, are political instruments that express the priority set by countries and societies. So we are having a problem right now because we have a machinery, we have an institution that really needs, self-assessment and transformation by multiple agents, with the leadership of member states, with the technical, I would say, allyship of the executive, of the bureaucracy of the UN, but the ownership of societies. And that includes, of course, the private sector, with clear rules, clear engagement responsibilities, clear accountability. In all these years at the UN, there is something that makes everybody nervous, which is corporate capture of the organization. And for that, to prevent that, we need clarity in rules, and we need to bring the private sector as an absolute vital actor, not only to sign the checks. Well, we don't have checks anymore, but it shows how old I am.
Send the Venmo, maybe.
Exactly, but to be really engaged in improving how the system delivers on the ground.
Now, you spoke about the need to have consensus and understand these are shared priorities across member states. Dr. Wong, that's sort of first of all, there's not a lot that the world agrees on right now, period. but then take it a step further, that the world's two biggest economies seem to be further apart than they've been in years. So what do you think the US and China can agree on right now? And what do you hope happens as this relationship moves forward over the course of the next couple of years?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think that the world is at a crossroad. I mean, U.S. has been really, when they started the Bretton Woods system, they really championed this first round of globalization. But now it's unfortunate we're seeing, U.S. is back off quite a few of that. But China, on the other hand, actually is really making new contributions now. You can see, whatever we talk about here, China is making tremendous progress. Talk about lifting poverty. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty in 4 decades' time. Break the record. Something compatible to the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. But furthermore, 10 years ago, we signed the Paris Accord here, right? Mm-hmm. That's the consensus we have. UN, 193 countries signed that. Yet now, some countries said that it's a fake news. But China, was not a believer at that time. But now, after the consensus, China started to green revolution going on, and China become the leaders now. 2/3 of the renewable energy come out of China, right? And the whole world now, it's half of the world energy now is renewable, and 2/3 of it coming from China. So it's enormous. China is taking all this exercise. And talk about development too. And we see other countries abandoning that, but China actually already started the Belt and Road 13 years ago. They invest over $1 trillion and 3,000 projects. They built 10,000 railway in Africa, 100,000 highway in Africa, just for example, and many other countries, of course. So I think we need a new initiative. We need a new, really strong impetus for the globalization, for the consensus we have reached for the last 80 years. We should not abandon it. But right now we see there's a gap. What you should talk about U.S.-China relations, absolutely. But I do think that President Xi and President Biden are going to meet tomorrow in South Korea now. So
Trump.
Yeah, Trump. Yeah, Trump. Sorry, Trump. Actually, President Xi and President Trump going to meet tomorrow. So it's a good news. So I think now U.S. is getting used to, a new China, and I have to really take this as an equal equivalent. It's not really we're going to sanction everybody and then nobody going to respond. China going to respond. So I think it's now it's great that they're going to settle the things. They're going to create stability. I'm sure also that in the next year, the two leaders going to probably meet 3 times. In the spring we're going to welcome President Trump visiting China, and in the fall probably President should go to the United States. So I hope that the two biggest countries would have to think about the world in their mind and really maintain some stability. I'm very glad that Rubio, the Secretary of State, said we need to seek strategic stability with China rather than strategic rivalry. So that's something changed, I think, in the government of U.S. position. So I hope that strategic stability we can reach, not only between China and the U.S., but also with the world. And let's really work on that. And U.S.-China should lead the world in terms of this moral responsibility, not let the world fall down and let the world continue to be secured and also in peacemaking and also in making prosperity.
Mm-hmm. Jim, before we move to just a couple of final questions, the theme of this forum being new coalitions for peace and people and planet, new coalitions implies that the existing ones have failed, right? Or at very least are evolving. And we've heard, as we talk about new regional agreements and the rise of China in these multilateral organizations, is American leadership over? Is this just a temporary blip? And to what extent do you think it matters at this point on the global stage?
I do think it matters a lot, but I think we have to be realistic about the extent of American leadership. I mean, I mentioned these poll numbers because there is still quite a strong level of support among the American people for cooperating internationally. I mean, I think people, you see some of the radical statements that are coming from members of Congress and like, and I think you get a false impression about where the American people are. They understand that we're connected. They understand that these problems, but what they want, and I keep using the word, it is a pragmatic approach, is to recognize that there are only so far we can go. And so if the United States is not going to be the global provider of public goods in the way Henry talked about, that it did in the immediate aftermath of World War II. That's just a reality. That's not going to happen. Our engagement will be more selective. It will be more narrowly aligned with what people in the United States see as the benefit of international cooperation, but they're not against it. And so that's where I think the opportunity is here. I was very struck last night at the reception. The mayor of Paris talked about the meeting that she just had here with the mayors, including lots of mayors from the United States and around the world. That's happening. That's a reality. There are lots of mayors in the United States and governors and others who are deeply committed to the agenda on climate, for example, who deeply care about these humanitarian issues. So there are partners, and I think and that's why, I think it is really important to try to frame this. I mean, I understand. You can imagine, given my own background, that I have a lot of concerns about what the Trump administration is doing. But sort of presenting this as America is wrecking the world, I can understand why it might look that way from the outside, but the reality is it's important for the U.S. to be engaged and to recognize both there are limits to how engaged the U.S. will be, but it's not walking away. And I do think that that's where the opportunities lie. I do think there's an opportunity for a new refounding, a practical refounding with the tremendous ideas that this panel have had about this. I mean, this is a blueprint for how to take this forward, which you could get a lot of consensus for, including in the United States.
Yeah, no. Well, and thank God it's being recorded so we can share it with others, and maybe some of the ideas will catch on. So to bring it back to the UN as we're beginning to wrap up here, this question of Madam Secretary General, is it time for, by the way, there are a few people sitting here who I think would probably be in the running, but, is it time for a female Secretary General? How many people think the next Secretary General should be a woman? Raise your hand. Let's start right here with Madame Bachelet. Why do you think that, and why do you think that?
I'm going to say a stupid thing first. Sometimes when I see wars, I feel there's too much testosterone over there. and that leaders put in front issues that are not the most important thing. It's more about who wins and how do I come back to my own country with my own shoes that I was the champion. No, I think it will be a time for a women Secretary General. First of all, because I believe that even though it's tricky, because situations are very complex, and some people are saying we shouldn't speak about gender, and some people are thinking, even in the EU, if we need to stop talking about human rights, because that could make some people mad. I don't agree with it. Of course, for example, you could stop talking about gender, and you can speak about women's empowerment, women's rights, same rights and opportunities, but human rights, not to speak about that, I think it will be a great mistake, because it's one of the foundations of the UN, it's one of the foundations of human dignity and justice and respect. Having said that, there's never been a woman Secretary General. And women, we cannot say that every woman is the same. We have different kinds of women. No? We can see Margaret Thatcher and we can see Jacinda Ardern. I mean, I'm talking there's different kinds of leadership.
Yeah.
Some have a very strong leadership in one direction. Some of them have what we call empathetic leadership. I feel that's the kind of leadership we need in the world, in the countries. Empathetic doesn't mean sympathetic. It means that you can put yourself in the shoes of the other, so you can understand the problem, and you can try to find through dialogue, through negotiations, through innovation of ways, new strategies, how you can solve problems. And particularly women are very good at those issues. Call for some like soft power. I don't think they're soft, it's just another kind of leadership. But also because women believe a lot in prevention, and a lot of more comprehensive way of looking at things. I think women should have the opportunity. Would I say to my best friend, run for Secretary General?
Would you say it to yourself?
I will run for Secretary General. So that's fact. Because
you heard it here at the Paris Peace Forum.
Because I just cannot help it. If you can help and contribute, I will be there. I will always be where it's needed, if I get there.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. We have just 2 minutes left. That's the other room clapping, but so just 2 minutes left, and just very quickly, if I want to give anyone else who wants to weigh in, not necessarily on that issue, but just final thoughts as we button this conversation about important next steps in UN reform. If you each want to take just 30 seconds, please go ahead. Maybe start with Henry. Yeah.
No, I think women is really important. In 30 years ago in Beijing, we had a women conference of UN, and just this year we had another women conference again. So I think the women should really hold the half of the sky, as Chinese Chairman Mao said. So I would really want to see the next Secretary General of UN coming out of the UN and a female candidate, like we have quite a few sitting here.
There
Maria
are certainly a lot. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of great ones. Marietta,
Yeah,
would
so
you
I
like to
hope
say
we had, and Maria also is quite
Yes.
capable to do that too, probably.
I would say that we have to put together collective force and knowledge and political will to reform the system, including the UN, to be really functional. And maybe the coalitions that are more flexible in terms of decision making could also be one solution. And of course, under the condition they are fully open, inclusive, and in line with norms. Yeah. And EU will contribute, and we are going to really do our best to be a full supporter of the process. And on the female, I believe that we should have one, yes, because we are just pragmatic, we have common sense, and we deliver the results. Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, go ahead.
One of the themes that I've heard from my colleagues here is what we need is really to put a human face on the UN. And part of the reason why I really am enthusiastic about the idea of a woman Secretary General is I have 2 daughters, right? And I also work for 2 of the great women leaders in the United States, Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton. And I think part of it is what a woman and a woman's perspective brings, but it's also the human face and the ability to talk to people as people. Unfortunately, and we've heard about this, sometimes we get away from that in the UN, and is having a Secretary General who can really embody that seems to me to be a really important first step to this next generation of the UN and multilateralism.
Maria Fernanda, you get the last word.
Well, two headlines. The number one is the UN is facing a situation where it's now or never. We are in a tipping point, and we really need to embrace complexity. These are not things that are done by decree. This requires collective action, multiple agencies, coalitions of the willing, and the responsibility of member states to lead a transformation that is needed. So that's the number one, embrace complexity. This is complicated, but it's not impossible. And we have a responsibility as citizens, as heads of state, as public servants, et cetera, as civil society, as private sector. So it is an endeavor for all of us. The second headline is, for the ones that did not raise your hands with your question, Tony, if we need
Yeah.
I would ask.
You're on camera, by the way, yeah.
A different question. My question would be, why not?
Right.
Why not a woman? Why not a Madam Secretary General? It's not only a matter of demographic justice, because we are little more than half of the world's population. It is not only a matter of historical justice. After 80 years, it is about time. And number 3, it is about quality of leadership.
Yeah.
If you need something to be transformed and change profoundly, you need a woman leading.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Michelle Bachelet, Maria Fernanda Espinosa, Jim Steinberg, Marietta Jager, and Dr. Henry Wong. Thank you all, and thanks everybody for being here this morning.